unexpected that so many of these things are mentioned. So basically, of course, I can only work on all these topics because basically our field, which is called technology assessment, comes from parliamentary policy advice, the OTA, now defunct or not funded anymore in the US. And so traditionally we're very strong in this kind of policy advice, and we still are. And policymakers often ask us to work on all kinds of issues. So what I will explain a little bit of this background now, not to repeat what has kindly been said, but also to let you know what you can expect from me in this talk and the discussion and what not. So it's really not only a real pleasure but a real honor to be here. And when I explain some of this, this is KIT ITAS, and this is the projects in energy. When I explain a little bit about this is not only to say thank you to the funders, but really because I think it's part of what I want to say today. Because I really believe that in these times where we talk about all kinds of things, and I would say that's another topic, but a rise of irrationalism worldwide, I think it's extremely important that we as humanity, I know it's a very strong notion, but as humanity, find a way to talk about those issues that really matter. And one of them, of course, is this crucial human practice of science as well as technology development. And so I'm really happy to be here, and thank you again for all who made this possible. And one reason for this is in my talk I will, however, also talk about more fancy visions, which are often developed by scientists, engineers, but also by philosophers and others. And I talk about them also because they are relevant with regard to the public understanding of current technoscience, including the views of politicians. So I'm a media contact person more for these kind of cyborg issues, human-machine interaction. And so I get every week, in the meantime, in Germany for 2.5 years now, some national media, some journalists who produce something for national media. And there's often, it's quite shocking to see politicians are reading quality newspapers, but in quality newspaper everything gets mixed up and extremely hyped. So I would say some of the things that you have mentioned concerning this fundamental relevance of computation are not really known, and to some extent I would say they're frightening. Often it just ends up like, oh, the scientists wanted to turn us in computers or something. this kind of level. That's a translation problem, and this is to some extent unfortunately also caused by some people who are overselling certain developments in science. I will come back to this. I had originally in my talk I had more on the sublime, but since we had in the morning we had this wonderful presentation already, I changed this a little bit. So what I wanted to say, without now talking too much about the project, is we are working in several parts, and what is quite interesting is that in our project it was very well received by the evaluators, and it has, I think, become a kind of major success of the project that we included art to a large extent in our activities. And what I really find interesting, and this is a wonderful example, we need more of this, is this kind of natural science and engineering on one hand, social science and humanities, philosophy, and art and design. I think that's the way where we can really produce knowledge and we can really express perspectives that can also help us to not enlighten the public, because the public is not stupid, but to help them to see the various aspects of these discussions. Okay, that's also not, you don't have to read all this stuff. So what I also wanted to point out is that at KIT ITAS, which is running, as has been said, this office at the Parliament for quite some time now, and has renewed, the contract was renewed several times, there is this interest of policymakers. And for example, we just have finished a study on human-machine interaction, where it was Mensch-Maschine-Entgrenzung, which could be roughly translated the blurring of boundaries between humans and machines. And this really included also a part where we looked more broadly also at the public and ethical and mass media discussions about these kind of topics. Okay, I have to, whoops. What I tried to say in this talk is basically, I find it interesting, but I have not really made up my mind about this, but I think this notion of programmable matter to some extent can maybe serve as a kind of guiding vision, as a kind of overarching vision for many developments in such fields as that are known, for example, as nanotechnology or synthetic biology, because it's basically a kind of idea of forming matter in a new way, which, as I will also talk in the end, referring to the work of Bernadette Consort-Vincent, who is also a member of our project in Synergy, also leads to a kind of new status of materials and matter at large, so to say. In the next slides, I will mainly talk about these very far-reaching visions of emergent humanity. You have seen already in this talk the kind of real research, technology development, thinking what is done in these areas, and now I'm more turning into more speculative visions and thinking about similar or the same developments. So, oops, sorry. So these pictures, I didn't get the copyright, so I hope, so don't tell anyone. No, I'm joking. This is I really focus on this one person, and I don't want to make any fun of him. It would be ridiculous if I would make fun about him, because he's a wonderful engineer, and he's in some way a brilliant thinker, and he's at the same time, so to say, the most prominent so-called transhumanist prophet who believes in a kind of overcoming of the human body, and I will tell you about his ideas later on. Why we are talking about this stuff for quite a time now, since 2001 or so, is that, for example, in the US there existed in the nano context some very wild ideas which were expressed in a workshop with DARPA and organized by NSF and the Department of Commerce and so on. So there is some policy relevance, and the European Union or the Commission staff, as well as German policymakers in other countries, they really wanted to know what's going on there. So they really wanted us to react to some extent in different contexts to these visions, which are really strong, like even mind uploading was mentioned in this report, which really looked like a kind of government report. Okay, that's one thing, but it's not really so, I would say, influential, because it's a certain policy discussion. But sorry, there's not tourism, of course, but futurism. It would be nice, tourism. There are some things in nanotechnology, and I really would like to see this in the discussion, because at the core, I would say, they are not far away from real thoughts, thoughts in this field, which really touch on real aspects, but they're exaggerating many of these things. There's a long tradition, but to some extent it's also a little bit unfair how they, for a while, treated this very futuristic thinker, because in the end, many of the things that they had mentioned already decades ago or so were probably not so unrealistic as it discussed now. And at the moment, in the field of synthetic biology, advanced genetic engineering, for example, George Church, he is certainly a brilliant researcher, and he's writing books like Regenesis, so the idea to recreate life and all these visions of human enhancement, etc. And de-instinct, even, for example, ethically or morally very problematic, like the idea we could create a Neanderthal man or something like this. And this is something which I do not morally say that's okay. This one with Neanderthal man is really problematic, but I would say these strong visions are not morally wrong. Necessarily, maybe we can discuss with them, but it's a real problem in terms of public communication of science, because it really, a journalist looks for an interesting story, and so they will probably more often choose some of these wild ideas of a respected researcher than maybe these less interesting stories, which are mainly good for, say, science journalism, but not for broader stuff. So, and I think, for example, these topics have even made it to the title of Spiegel, which is our probably most influential German print medium. And there is a kind of, not to say like it's only them, the engineers, there's also among ethicists and social scientists, even also technology assessment, of course, many people who are very much interested in these topics and writing a lot about it. And we must be honest with ourselves, it's also a very good way of getting grants, because it's a really interesting topic and everything must be new and controversial. And so, of course, they often ask us to talk about these things. But I would say politically and concerning concerning forces in our society, the core factor of these visions being so influential are figures in the IT industry. Like I just gave this picture, you know this Gates and the Google founders. They said already 15 years ago, one of the Google founders was asked, what is your long-term vision for Google, and said Google in the brain. And both founders repeated that, of course, artificial intelligence will outpace human intelligence in the future, and of course we need to become cyborgs. And then there is this very problematic guy, this Peter Thiel, who is now Trump's IT silicon guy. He directly funds many people who are developing these kind of ideas. And we could go on, like Intel, letting him talk about the singularity. Singularity is a kind of messianic break in the future, like where everything has changed, which we cannot imagine at this point, and we can even become immortal and all this kind of stuff. And there's a kind of relevance of these discussions because they're publicly relevant, and I think this is something where in our institute in the last 10 years or so, we increasingly look at the way how these visions are used in policy contexts and in public discussions. To give you a view of Kurzweil's view of evolution, it's epigonic, so it's not really original. I will come back this shortly in a minute. It starts with physics and chemistry, information in atomic structures, and ends with the universe wakes up, patterns of matter and energy in the universe become saturated with intelligence processes and knowledge. And this is explained as a kind of necessary development it's a kind of necessary development. And yeah, it's good. But I wouldn't definitely not only laugh about it, because it is deeply connected, at least with a certain Western mindset. And I think it, even in their quasi-religious aspects, it offers an explanation for a crucial problem of our times, mainly how we relate to science and technology, because I would say in the West, at least, we relate to science and technology unnecessarily, in my point of view, as a means of salvation, instead of, and this brings some irrationality in our discussions, but it's a more complicated problem, I would say. I would like to point a little bit on, also, we had this wonderful talk in the morning, but I would say there's something like the sublime of life, and I would say the sublime of life, as you heard in the morning, the sublime is always connected also with fear and awe to some extent. And I think evolutionary thinking, there is one basic point where there's some kind of awe, because these very long periods of time. This is something we cannot, as single humans, we can not really fully intellectually and emotionally grasp to some extent. And then you can see, like, I'm a real fan of Erasmus Darwin stuff to some extent. You can see some very beautiful evocations of these kind of glorification of evolution. And I also would like to point out, like, Shelley, like, this is really nice because he really argues the part down there. You see, okay, that's a very typical way of dealing with these issues, and we'll find this again and again in the next 150 years after. So life in the world, or whatever we call that, which we are and feel, is an astonishing thing. The mist of familiarity obscures us from the wonder of our being. We are struck with admiration at some of its strengths and modifications, but it is itself the great miracle. So what are changes of empires? And that's, I think, something, what are changes of empires? The wreck of dynasties with opinions which supported them. What is the birth and the extinction of religious and of political systems to life? What are the revolutions of the globe which we inhabit, and the operations of the elements of which it is composed compared with life? And yet, what is the universe of stars and suns, of which this inhabited earth is one, and the motions and the destiny compared with life? So this is a very strong tradition. I could give you many other examples of poets and scientists who repeat this to some extent. And most of it you will probably already know, but maybe you haven't heard about this gentleman. It's Winwood Reade, who was an Africa explorer and corresponded with Darwin. And he was, after his death, he became a hero of the secular, anti-religious secular groups in the UK. And after one of his travels, in West Africa. He wrote a book, maybe in a feverish condition, I don't know. But in the last two chapters of this book, which is called The Martyrdom of Man from 1872, he basically, in 2 chapters, he outlined, it's a universal history, and he outlined in the last 2 chapters how the future might look like. And basically what he says, and here you can see that I'm mixing in this talk to some extent this one topic which is more humans and machines and life and technology. He basically argues that science, these bodies are these ape bodies, so to say. We already realize how deficient they are and that they do not fit to our beautiful mind anymore. And so science will find ways to do this, and then all these transhumanist stuff, I have here took a quote from a current transhuman or quite current transhumanist declaration, and all these kind of individual immortality, extinction of disease, exploration of the infinite and the conquest of creation, so this kind of outward idea like our destiny in the universe. You can already find this in 1872, and you can also see that human evolution in the sense of scientific progress is, so to say, seen as the way of life, to proceed. So and the martyrdom of man. So the sublime in it is this endless suffering, or not endless suffering, because there might be some future where the suffering ends, but it's this org of all these generations suffering and struggling to become who we are. Now we are back to an important author, a very important author, and he was a world intellectual in these times, like Lenin and Roosevelt and Stalin and all met, gave him interviews, and he was a really important person. He's often forgotten. He's only seen as a pioneer of science fiction, but people who were looking, was, I think, the most prolific writer in Nature, even in the first decades. Of course, not with Nature, more with science education stuff. So. And here we have again this life struggling out of intertidal slime, struggling from shape to shape, and then we start so low, and now it's the human that we are, and then the question, what comes after man? And then this is this idea, still only thought biological in these times, and not what comes then. Here, Bernal, an eminent scientist, there were several others like Julian Huxley and Haldane and so, and he's the guy who said, why biology? Why these long things? Why can you not simply create the new man? And there is this wonderful essay, The World of Flesh and the Devil, an inquiry into the future of the three enemies of the rational soul from 1929, where some science fiction scholars have argued that this is a kind of blueprint of modern science fiction. And one of the quotes there is, the new man must appear to those, and that's the monster that we also talked about already, the new man must appear to those who have not contemplated him before as a strange, monstrous, and inhuman creature, but he is only the logical outcome of the type of humanity that exists at present. Normal man is an evolutionary dead end. Mechanical man, apparently a break in organic evolution, is actually more in the true tradition of a further evolution. So I put these pictures on because he was not only his Crick and Watson explaining him. One of them wanted to be in his lab, but there were already too many brilliant minds there, he could not come. And he was also communist, and Picasso, drinking red wine, painted this at the wall of his building, which is now in the Welcome Trust in the entrance area. And by the way, he's also pioneered our kind of research in science and technology studies and technology assessment. So he's a larger-than-life figure like many of them. So, but what I wanted to point out is that besides this cyborg vision that he develops, and he also develops ideas for spaceships, which are still discussed or stuff, but besides this cyborg vision, he has the idea that it's not only his idea is a brain, a tube, and this is connected to machinery. But he's not only talking about the cyborg stuff, but what he's also doing is, he said, the process of our evolution is a way of getting rid, so to say, of the old life. And so what he says, in the end, because he had he comes, I think, from American and an old Jewish family, but he was Catholic and Irish nationalist. And so in his youth he was was a Catholic, almost fanatic boy, so really like believer. And so in the end of this process, where traditional life is overcome, he develops a kind of almost Gnostic vision of us becoming atoms in space, communicating by radiation and all this stuff. And the funny thing is that but basically the same ideas are now sold by Kurzweil in his books, with this idea of that the entire universe becomes intelligent matter. Okay, and coming back to this programmable matter stuff, so I have not talked about these more far-reaching visions, but I think there is something going on here which, apart from these visions, whose relevance in the history of years is another topic that one could discuss, and which are definitely relevant for the public communication of science. There is something, say, in these developments where there might be a kind of paradigm change. Like Bernadette Besson, she argued that this idea of control over nature, and emancipation of the human condition from material constraints, which is a part of the human condition, is still prevailing. But at the same time, materials are more and more objects of choice, like of design to say, objects of care, as she argues, and partners of human technological project. One could now argue that sounds strange from a traditional humanistic point of view, but in fact, this notion of partners might not be entirely outlandish, so to say. I would say it's definitely not outlandish, because to some extent, I'm not familiar with, not really familiar, as a political scientist I cannot really talk about this in biology, but it's quite clear that developments in artificial intelligence are not going in the direction of hell in the movie, but it's clearly more and more difficult for us to understand how the artifacts that we are creating work, so they can surprise us. And so the notion of partner we should not misunderstand as they are like us, but as us, but they are also not something that we have created and entirely understand what they're doing. And I guess biology is always a messy thing, and many of these visions, stronger visions, were not true, because biology is much more, and life is much more complex and complicated as one thing. So in this sense, maybe partner makes sense. And then this new life, and life now very broadly seen, so also something which is quasi-life only, could be, in Bernal's sense, would conserve none of the substance, but all of the spirit of the old life. How many minutes do I have? 5. Oh, I'm in time. I'm incredible. I didn't think so. Okay. The sublime. I hope, because I had some slides also on Kant, but it didn't make sense after the talk in the morning. So what I would like to argue in the end is that we have a kind of new sublime, which a kind of transhumanist techno-scientific sublime. One could ask, how can we feel we can have this feeling of awe with something that we have created? But it's often forgotten that already in work or so, some, of course, buildings or so can be sublime to some extent, or we can have feelings like this with buildings, for example. And I would argue the reason why there is this kind of fascination also with this very outlandish vision of the future is because it's an extension and a continuation of this modern fascination with life, with evolutionary life, so the sublime of life. And all these narratives which portray human destiny as a cosmic struggle, a struggle in which the self-organizing species marches like an army, these pictures, now for them, besides science fiction, we are not used to them anymore. Just take a book, Science Communication, or even essays of leading scientists just 60, 70 years ago, you will find exactly this kind of narrative in very many of their attempts to communicate the relevance of their work to the public. And what I wanted to point out finally is that in transhumanism, especially, I would say it's again a narrowing down. It's kind of not taking all these developments into account, but a kind of focus on a kind of emancipation of human corporeality. So the idea that the mind is what is precious in us, the body is just an imperfect vessel, and we need to overcome this. And this is a kind of, I would say, almost obsession in this line of thinking, which has, I think, some connection to other more important traditions in our Western thought, which might need to be problematized or discussed to some extent. Okay, I'll stop here. I hope it was not too many things mixing, but many thanks for your attention.